The morning Mae Bell drove her wagon into Calico Flats, Texas, the whole town stopped breathing for just a moment, because no one had ever seen a woman arrive alone with a deed in her hand and determination, written clear across her face like scripture carved into stone. It was the spring of 1879, and the Texas Panhandle was a land still finding its shape, still deciding what it wanted to be, a wild thing slowly learning to walk upright, full of cattle drives and dusty main streets and men who measured their worth by the size of their herd. Calico Flats sat at the edge of that wildness, a modest town of perhaps 300 souls, with a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a meeting hall on Saturdays, and one saloon that the preacher's wife pretended she could not see from the parsonage window. It was not a grand town, but it was a working one, and the people in it had seen enough trouble to respect anyone who showed up willing to work. Mae Bell was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that caught the light in a way that made men forget what they were saying, and green eyes sharp enough to see through excuses before they had been fully formed. She wore a practical brown traveling dress that had seen better days, and her hands, even gloved, showed the faint calluses of a woman who had not spent her life sitting at a parlor piano. She had come from Missouri, from a town called Clover Hollow, where she had spent 8 years teaching school, watching the world happen outside her window, until the school board had quietly replaced her with a man who had never taught a single day in his life, but whose uncle sat on the town council. After that, she had spent 6 months reading land advertisements in the St. Louis papers until she found it one paragraph, tucked between a mining claim and a cattle notice, describing an abandoned schoolhouse in Calico Flats, Texas, available for private purchase at a price that was embarrassingly low, because no one local had wanted it. Mae Bell had wanted it. She had taken every cent of her savings, every dollar she had set aside over 8 years of modest Missouri wages, and she had bought it through a land office in Amarillo without ever having laid eyes on it. She was not reckless. She had done her research. She had written 3 letters to the Calico Flats postmaster, asking about water availability, the state of the road, the general disposition of the local population toward newcomers. The postmaster, a man named Gerald Holt who wrote in a cramped and slightly suspicious hand, had replied that the town was fine, the water adequate, and the population disposed toward newcomers the way it was disposed toward weather. You couldn't always predict it, but you generally found a way to live with it. She took that as encouragement. What she had not researched, or perhaps had not thought to research, was the man whose property sat directly to the north of the old schoolhouse lot. A cattle rancher named Phineas Cooper, who had lived on his land for 11 years, and who had grown entirely accustomed to the quiet stretch of empty ground beside his fence line, and who was going to have very strong feelings about the fact that it was no longer empty. Phineas Cooper was 32 years old. He was the kind of man who looked like he had been made for the landscape broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ears when it grew too long, which it usually did because he forgot about haircuts when he was busy, and he was almost always busy. He had a jaw that could have been cut from the limestone bluffs along the Red River, and brown eyes that carried in them the particular quality of a man who had learned to observe before he spoke. He ran 1,100 head of cattle on his property, the Cooper Ranch, which covered just over 4,000 acres of grassy Texas flatland. He had a crew of 6 men, a cook named Domingo who had come up from San Antonio 15 years ago and never found a reason to leave, and a border collie named Biscuit who slept at the foot of his bed and considered herself the true foreman of the operation. Phineas was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had organized his life with great care and who did not appreciate surprises. The day Mae Bell arrived, Phineas was mending the north fence line, the one that ran along the boundary of the old schoolhouse property, when he heard the wagon. He looked up over the top fence rail and saw it coming down the road from town, a sturdy canvas-covered wagon pulled by 2 capable-looking brown horses, driven by a woman sitting very straight on the bench with a traveling bag at her feet, and what appeared to be a considerable quantity of lumber tied along the side. He straightened up from his work and watched her turn the wagon off the main road and onto the overgrown track that led to the old schoolhouse. He watched her pull the horses to a stop in front of the building. He watched her climb down from the wagon without waiting for any assistance, plant both boots on the weedy ground, and stand with her hands on her hips looking at the building in front of her with an expression that was part assessment and part something else, something he couldn't quite name from this distance. The schoolhouse had been abandoned for 7 years. The last teacher had left after a dispute with the school board, a story Phineas knew only vaguely. And since then the building had been sitting empty, its windows filmed over with dust, its roof developing a slow and progressive lean toward the southeast, its front steps rotting quietly in the Texas heat. It was not an attractive sight. Most people who had looked at it over the years had looked away fairly quickly. The woman with the auburn hair was not looking away. Phineas watched her walk around the perimeter of the building, examining it with the focused attention of a person who was not seeing what was there but what could be there. He saw her crouch down to look at the foundation stones. He saw her push experimentally on the front wall. He saw her look at the roof with an expression of honest concern, then make some kind of decision that settled in her face like a verdict, and go back to her wagon to start unloading. He realized he had been standing at his fence line for a good 15 minutes doing nothing but watching a woman he had never met examine a building he had spent 7 years ignoring. He picked up his fence pliers and went back to work, but he found himself glancing north more often than the job required. The next morning, Mae Bell was up before the sun. She had spent her first night in Calico Flats at the boarding house run by a woman named Ruth Crandall, who had asked approximately 40 questions over supper, and who seemed to land somewhere between admiration and deep concern when she learned about the schoolhouse purchase. Mae Bell had answered the questions with patience and good humor, eaten 2 helpings of Ruth's beef stew, slept better than she had in weeks, and risen before dawn feeling clearer in her mind than she had in years. She was back at the schoolhouse by the time the first gray light was spreading across the flat Texas horizon. She had brought her notebook, a measuring tape, and a list she had been writing and revising for 6 months. She moved through the building methodically, assessing every surface, testing every board, noting every place where rot had taken hold, and every place where the structure remained sound. The main room, which had served as the classroom, was large and well-proportioned, with 4 windows and a good fireplace. 2 smaller rooms at the back had served as the teachers' quarters. The roof needed significant work. 3 sections had developed leaks that had damaged the flooring beneath. The front steps were beyond saving. The windows needed new glass in 2 panes. The entire building needed to be cleaned and painted, both inside and out. It was a significant amount of work. Mae Bell added up the cost in her notebook and then sat quietly for a moment on the dusty floor of the main room, looking at her figures, doing the kind of mathematical reassessment that arrives when a plan moves from theory to reality. She could do it. It would take most of her remaining money and most of the summer, but she could do it. She was sitting on the front step, the least rotten one making notes when she heard footsteps on the weedy ground and looked up to find a man standing at the edge of the property. He was tall, with a cattleman's build and a gray work shirt, and he was carrying his hat in one hand in a way that suggested he had remembered manners at the last moment. "Morning," he said. "I'm Phineas Cooper. I run the ranch next door." Mae Bell looked at him steadily. "Mae Bell," she said, "I bought this property last month." "I heard that," Phineas said. He looked at the building, then back at her. "You plan to live here." "I plan to restore it and operate a school," Mae Bell said. "This town hasn't had a school teacher in 7 years. I looked into the records. There are children here who have had no formal education at all." Phineas absorbed this. He looked at the building again with the expression of a man revising an opinion he hadn't known he'd formed. "It's in rough shape," he said. "I'm aware, Mae Bell said pleasantly. "That's why I'm taking notes." There was a pause. A mockingbird somewhere behind the building went through its repertoire loudly, filling the silence with borrowed songs. "You're doing this alone?" Phineas asked. Mae Bell looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who had been asked some version of this question for most of her adult life. "I have a notebook, a measuring tape, and 8 years of savings," she said. "I believe that's sufficient to begin." Phineas turned his hat over in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to speak. Then he said, "The roof on the north side, that overhang there, I can see from my property that one of the rafter sets is partially collapsed. If it comes down in a storm, it'll take that whole section of wall with it." Mae Bell looked at the north side of the roof, then she looked back at him. "How long ago did that happen?" "Last winter," he said, "after the ice storm in February." She wrote something in her notebook. "Thank you for the information," she said. "That moves it up my priority list." Phineas nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not impolite but was definitely thorough. Then he said, "There's a carpenter in town, fellow named Gus Hartley. He's reliable. Mention my name and he'll give you a fair price." "I appreciate that," Mae Bell said. He nodded again, turned, and walked back toward his fence line. Mae Bell watched him go for just a moment, then looked back at her notebook. She wrote the name Gus Hartley at the top of her list, and beneath it she wrote, "North Rafter Urgent." She did not write anything about the rancher with the careful brown eyes, but she did notice that he had walked back to his fence and resumed working rather than continuing in either direction, which meant that his fence work had brought him precisely to the point nearest the schoolhouse, which was an interesting coincidence. Over the following days, Calico Flats adjusted to the presence of Mae Bell with the gradual, slightly bewildered welcome of a town discovering that what it had been missing was something it hadn't thought to want. The women of the town, the wives and daughters who came to the general store and the dry goods counter, found reasons to walk past the schoolhouse property with increasing frequency. Mae Bell, who was cheerful and direct, and not in the least bit intimidated by the sideways looks, always waved. By the end of the first week, 3 of the women had stopped to introduce themselves. The first was Clara Hennessy, the blacksmith's wife, who had 4 children between the ages of 5 and 12, and who had been teaching them to read herself with a Bible and considerable determination. She had brown practical hair and a firm handshake, and she looked at Mae Bell with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular kind of help. "You're truly going to open a school," Clara said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Mae Bell said, "once the building is sound. My oldest Thomas, he's 12. He reads well enough, but his arithmetic is behind, and my youngest Pearl, she hasn't started yet." Clara paused. "We've been managing, but managing isn't the same as proper learning." "No," Mae Bell agreed. "It isn't." The second was Dolores Vega, whose husband ran the livery stable, and who had 2 boys, both of school age, who were currently helping their father rather than receiving any education at all. Dolores was small and precise, with quick dark eyes that evaluated Mae Bell thoroughly in the first 30 seconds of their introduction, and apparently found the evaluation satisfactory. She had come with her husband's cart, loaded with a donated bucket of whitewash paint, because she had decided the night before that the schoolhouse would need whitewashing, and that she was going to provide the paint before anyone asked. "My husband thinks I am wasting the paint," Dolores said, handing over the bucket without ceremony. "He will think differently when our sons can read a contract before signing it." The third was Ruth Crandall herself, who had been turning the situation over in her mind since Mae Bell's first night at the boarding house, and had come to offer the use of her summer kitchen for cooking during the restoration work. "You can't eat cold food all summer," Ruth said, with the decisive tone of someone who had already made up their mind and was informing you of the outcome. "I'll put a plate out for you every evening. You'll need the strength." Mae Bell thanked all 3 women with genuine warmth. She was not accustomed to this kind of community in Missouri. She had always been somewhat apart, the schoolteacher who lived above the schoolhouse, and observed the town's domestic life from a careful professional distance. Here, in this rough-edged Texas town, she was being folded in with a directness that surprised her and moved her more than she expected. She got up before dawn the next morning feeling like she was where she was supposed to be. Gus Hartley, the carpenter, came out on the third day. He was a lanky man in his 50s with sawdust permanently in his hair and a calm professional manner that Mae Bell immediately trusted. He walked the building with her, checked the roofline, peered at the rafters through a gap in the ceiling, and gave her an estimate that was fair below what she had feared, above what she had hoped. "Phineas Cooper sent you," he said, not as a question. "He suggested you," Mae Bell said. Gus nodded slowly, in the way of someone adding a piece of information to a larger calculation they're running. "He's a good man," he said simply. "Hard to know sometimes, but good." Mae Bell filed that away without comment. Gus could start the following Monday, he said. The roof repair would take 2 weeks if the weather held. He'd need her to hire on a couple of hands for the heavy lifting, and he knew 2 young men in town who were reliable and could use the work. Mae Bell agreed to everything and wrote the payment schedule in her notebook. After Gus left, she stood in the main room of the schoolhouse and looked at the play of afternoon light through the dusty windows, and she felt for the first time the specific thrill of a plan beginning to move from paper into the physical world. It was a feeling she had learned to love, that moment when the imagined thing starts to become real. She was so absorbed in this feeling that she almost didn't hear the sound at the door. She turned to find Phineas Cooper standing in the open doorway, hat in hand again, looking as though he had walked over and was now not entirely sure why. "Gus came out?" he asked. "This morning," Mae Bell said. "He's going to start Monday." Phineas nodded, looking around the interior of the main room with a slow professional assessment that reminded Mae Bell of the way she herself had looked at it. He looked at the fireplace, the windows, the floor. He looked at the teaching space with a kind of thoughtfulness that seemed to go beyond architectural evaluation. "There used to be a wood stove over here," he said, moving to the center of the room and indicating a faint rectangular discoloration on the floor. "For the winter months, more efficient than the fireplace for a room full of children." "What happened to it?" Mae Bell asked. "Removed when the school closed. Someone took it. Most of the furnishings walked off over the years." He paused. "The desks and the teacher's table, those were real good oak pieces, made by a fellow who lived here before my time. Those are gone too." Mae Bell looked at the empty floor. "I'll need to have new ones made," she said. "Gus can do that once the structure's sound," Phineas said. They stood in silence for a moment in the empty room. The afternoon light came through the filmed windows in long dusty bars. Outside, a pair of meadowlarks were conducting an argument in the grass. "You grew up here?" Mae Bell asked. "Came when I was 21, Phineas said. "From Tennessee." He paused. "My father's ranch. I wanted my own." "Did you get it?" Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "Eventually," he said. Mae Bell looked at him. He was looking at the windows, at the dust-filtered light, with the same expression he'd had when she first saw him at the fence line, that quality of careful observation, of a man who paid attention. She found herself wondering what he actually thought about when he stood like that, what calculations and considerations were running behind those steady brown eyes. She told herself that was not a relevant line of thinking. She had a schoolhouse to fix. "I should get back to my list," she said. Phineas turned from the window. Something in his posture shifted a slight recalibration, as though he had been reminded of a boundary he'd been leaning past. "Of course," he said. He settled his hat back on his head. "If you need anything water access, your horse is watered during the day, my hands can manage that. The well on this property is probably not reliable. It hasn't been used in years." Mae Bell looked at him steadily. "That's very generous," she said. "Practical," he said. "You're next door." He left. Mae Bell stood in the quiet room for a moment, then went back to her list. She had a great deal to do, and she was not in the habit of letting interesting distractions slow her down. But she did write, in very small letters at the bottom of the page, the word, "wood stove," because she would need one. and because it was practically the most useful piece of information anyone had given her since she arrived. The following week, Gus Hartley arrived with his tools and his two young hired men brothers named Sam and Willie Pryor, 17 and 20, sun-browned and good-natured and happy to have work, and Mae Bell's summer of restoration truly began. It was hard, physical, consuming work, and Mae Bell loved almost every minute of it. She was not the kind of woman who stood aside and directed. She was up on the ladder with a pry bar pulling off damaged shingles. She was on her hands and knees pulling rotten floorboards. She was mixing whitewash and applying it to the exterior walls with a wide brush in long sweeping strokes until her arms ached, and the building began, slowly, to look like itself again. Gus worked with quiet efficiency, explaining what he was doing and why, and Mae Bell listened and learned and asked questions that made him look at her with increasing respect. "Most people just want it done," he said one afternoon, watching her study the joint where a new rafter met the old ridgeline. "They don't want to know how." "I want to know how," Mae Bell said simply. "If something goes wrong in the middle of winter, I need to know how to address it." Gus nodded. "Fair," he said. "The townspeople came and went throughout the days, some to watch, some to help, some just to bring food and opinions. Ruth Crandall came every other day with a covered basket of food and would sit on a sawbuck and talk while Mae Bell ate. Clara Hennessy brought her oldest son Thomas to help with clearing brush on 3 consecutive Saturdays, and Thomas turned out to be a serious-faced boy who worked hard and asked careful questions about what the school would be like when it opened, as though he was evaluating an institution before committing to enrollment. "Will there be arithmetic?" he asked Mae Bell one Saturday morning. "Arithmetic, reading, writing, geography, and history," Mae Bell said. Thomas considered this. "What kind of history?" "All kinds," Mae Bell said, "including the history of Texas, which is considerable." Thomas appeared to find this acceptable. Dolores Vega came with her husband Ramon on a Sunday, and the two of them spent the entire day painting the interior of the main room with a whitewash that Dolores had mixed herself to a precise consistency. And they did it efficiently and without fuss. And when Mae Bell tried to thank them, Ramon said simply that his sons were going to learn in this room, so it had better look decent. Throughout all of this, Phineas Cooper was a consistent presence at the edges of the work, not intrusively, not with the manner of someone pushing his way in, but with the steady attentiveness of a man who could not quite stay away. He appeared at the fence line in the mornings when he was working that section of the property, which happened with what Mae Bell privately noted was suspicious frequency. He walked over twice in the first week, once to tell her that a section of the south wall needed to be checked for ant damage before painting, and once to bring over a bucket of real well water from his property, because he had seen Sam and Willie hauling water from the town pump a quarter-mile away, and considered it unnecessary. He did not stay long on either visit. He said what he came to say and went back to his work. But Mae Bell noticed that he always looked at the building with genuine attention, assessing the progress, seeing what had changed. And she noticed that he always found some small practical thing to say, some piece of information that was genuinely useful, as though he was working very hard to make sure his visits had an official purpose. She found this endearing. She told herself she should not find it endearing. At the end of the second week, when Gus had finished the roof repair and the new front steps had been installed, and the exterior was fully whitewashed and glowing in the June sunshine, Mae Bell stood in the road and looked at the building and felt a wave of emotion so strong it surprised her. It looked real now. It looked like a school. It looked like the thing she had been imagining since she opened that newspaper in Missouri. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Phineas Cooper standing a few feet away, looking at the building with the same focused expression. He had not come up quietly on purpose. She had simply been too absorbed to hear him. He was dusty from the day's work, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, hat pushed back slightly on his head. "It looks good," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, a warmth, a genuineness that made the simple words feel like considerably more. "It does," Mae Bell agreed. They stood together looking at it for a moment in the golden late afternoon light. The whitewashed walls caught the sun and held it, glowing back at the flat blue Texas sky. The new front steps were solid cedar, fragrant in the heat. The windows, which had been cleaned and reglazed where needed, reflected the light in bright, honest squares. "I thought about this building a lot over the years," Phineas said. "Watching it go to ruin." He paused. 7 years is a long time for a town to go without a school. "The children here need it badly," Mae Bell said. "I've met several now. They're bright and eager. They've just had no formal opportunity." Phineas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are some children on the ranch, too. My cook Domingo's grandchildren. He has 3 of them living with him now, his daughter's children. Ages 6, 8, and 10. He paused. "I've been paying a woman in town to give them reading lessons, but it's not consistent." Mae Bell turned to look at him. "They'd be very welcome," she said. He looked at her then directly, fully, not the sideways assessment he'd been employing during their previous conversations, but a real look, the kind where you let someone see that you're paying attention. Mae Bell held that look without looking away. Something passed between them in that moment that was entirely without words and also entirely unmistakable. "I should get back," Phineas said. "Good evening, Mr. Cooper," Mae Bell said. He walked back toward his property. Mae Bell turned to look at the schoolhouse again, but the building was considerably less interesting to her than it had been 10 minutes ago, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that fact. The weeks that followed brought a shifting in the nature of the restoration work. The urgent structural repairs were done, the bones were sound, and the work now moved to the finer tasks of building a real school rather than just a solid building. Mae Bell spent her mornings teaching herself carpentry basics from a book she had ordered from a St. Louis catalog, a comprehensive guide to woodworking for household purposes, and spent her afternoons applying what she had learned under Gus's watchful eye. She made the smaller furniture herself: shelves for the classroom, a storage box for chalk and slates, a rack for hanging coats near the door. The larger pieces, desks and the teacher's table, were made by Gus, who constructed them from good pine with the solid workmanship of a man who takes furniture personally. He made 12 student desks, each with a small inkwell hole drilled in the upper right corner, and a teacher's table with a drawer that ran smooth and closed with a satisfying sound. It was during one of these afternoons, while Mae Bell was sanding the surface of a shelf she had built from a pine board that had been giving her trouble all morning, that Phineas Cooper came over the fence line with a different kind of purpose than usual. He was not carrying fence tools or water buckets. He was carrying a wood stove. Not personally, he had 2 of his ranch hands with him, strong young men named Carlos and Pete, and they were carrying the stove between them on a wooden pallet, moving carefully over the uneven ground. It was a good cast-iron stove, not new but not old either, with a clean stovepipe and all its parts intact. Mae Bell came out of the schoolhouse door and stopped on the new front steps. Phineas took off his hat. "Found this in the storage barn when we were clearing it out last month," he said. "Been sitting there since I bought the ranch. No use to me." He paused. "Thought it might be of use here." Mae Bell looked at the stove. She looked at Phineas. She thought about what Gus had told her about the wood stove that used to stand in the center of the room, and the discolored rectangle on the floor where it had stood, and she thought about whether a man who said practical things to justify his appearances had perhaps been thinking about this for longer than last month. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "that is extraordinarily kind of you." "It's just a stove," he said, but the back of his neck was slightly red in a way that the June sun alone did not account for. Carlos and Pete carried the stove inside and set it precisely over the discolored rectangle on the floor, which fit so perfectly it might have been made for it. Mae Bell watched this and felt something in her chest do a slow, warm, undeniable thing. She made coffee on her camp stove. She had been living in the restored teacher's quarters for 3 weeks by this point, sleeping on a cot and cooking on a small camp setup while she finished the main room and brought 3 cups out to the front steps. Carlos and Pete thanked her and took theirs at a respectful distance, engaged in conversation with Sam Pryor, who was trimming the wild grass from around the building. Phineas sat on the front steps beside Mae Bell, which was not precisely the protocol of a man dropping off a stove and leaving, but which also felt entirely natural, as though the steps had been built wide enough for exactly this. "You're planning to open in September," Phineas said. "The first week of September," Mae Bell said. "I've had 12 families confirm their children. 2 more families are considering it." 14 children, Phineas said. "Possibly 16. And Domingo's grandchildren would make 19. She looked at him. "That's more than I expected, honestly. I had budgeted for 10 when I made my original calculations." "This town has needed this for a long time," Phineas said. He looked out at the flat land, the distant shimmer of the grass. "When I first came here, 1868, that was the school was still running. It was the center of things. Sunday church town meetings. Children actually stayed in the county rather than families sending them east to relatives for schooling." He paused. "After it closed, things changed, not all at once, but you noticed." "What was the teacher like?" Mae Bell asked. "The one who was here before." Phineas was quiet for a moment. "Good man," he said. "Name was Harrison. Left on bad terms with the school board over something political. I never got the full story. Board wanted him to stop teaching certain subjects, I think. He refused." He looked at his coffee cup. "The board won and the town lost." Mae Bell nodded slowly. "That story is not unfamiliar to me," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Missouri," she looked at him. "You remember that from our first conversation." "I remember most things," he said, with the particular steadiness of a man who is making an admission without dressing it up as anything else. Mae Bell held his gaze for a moment, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on the steps and the particular quality of the silence between them. Not uncomfortable, not full of things unspoken, just quiet in the way of 2 people who have started to be at ease with each other and are noticing it. "The school board in Clover Hollow," she said, "decided a man with no teaching experience was preferable to a woman with 8 years of it. His uncle was on the board." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "I don't think they were wicked men. I think they just had a very specific idea of how the world should be arranged, and I stopped fitting into it." "Their loss," Phineas said. He said it simply, as a matter of fact rather than flattery. Mae Bell looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." The summer moved forward in the way that good, busy summers do, with so much work that the days felt short even as the light lasted long, with the specific pleasure of watching something build toward completion. Mae Bell continued her preparations, ordering textbooks through the Amarillo Land Office address that served as a postal contact, writing up a curriculum that covered reading and writing and arithmetic and geography and basic science, corresponding with a woman in Kansas who ran a similar rural school, and who sent her extraordinarily useful letters full of practical advice about managing mixed-age classrooms. She also, in ways she would not have predicted in Missouri, began to put roots into the community in a fashion that went beyond the school itself. She started attending Sunday services at the church, where the congregation received her with genuine warmth once it became clear she was staying. She became friends with Clara Hennessy, who turned out to have a dry humor and an enormous fund of local knowledge. She spent 2 Sundays with Dolar's Vega learning to make flour tortillas from a recipe Dolar's grandmother had brought from Mexico, which Mae Bell found delicious, and which she practiced until she could make them reliably on her camp stove. And she spent time with Phineas Cooper. This happened in a gradual, organic way that neither of them seemed to have precisely planned, but that also seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. He came over to help when a section of fence on the schoolhouse property needed replacing. The original split-rail fence that had marked the schoolyard boundary was half fallen and needed to be reset. He appeared one evening with a length of good cedar rail and a post-hole digger and simply started working. And Mae Bell came out and worked beside him, and they spent 3 hours setting posts and fitting rails in the golden evening light, talking easily about things large and small. He told her about the cattle business, about the spring drive, about the negotiations with the buyers in Abilene, about the particular challenges of the Texas Panhandle weather. He told her about his crew, about Carlos, who was 22 and wanted to save enough to start his own spread someday, about Pete, who sent money back to his family in New Mexico every month, about Domingo, who had been cooking since he was 14 and who made a tamale that Phineas considered proof of the benevolence of Providence. Mae Bell told him about Missouri, about the town of Clover Hollow and the 8 years of teaching, about the children she had taught, who she still thought about a girl named Annabelle who had loved geography with a passion that Mae Bell found beautiful, a boy named Marcus who had arrived barely able to read at age 10 and had been writing his own stories by age 13. She talked about what she thought education was for, really, not just filling children with facts but giving them tools, teaching them to think, to question, to construct an argument and evaluate one. Phineas listened to this with genuine engagement. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he had actually been following the thread of what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He had, she realized, the quality of a man who valued ideas even in the absence of formal education, and she found this not only attractive but rare. One evening in late July, when the fence was long finished and there was no official task to account for his presence, he came over anyway. He knocked on the open schoolhouse door, which Mae Bell had been leaving open in the evenings to let the days heat out, and leaned against the doorframe with the slightly careful air of a man who is doing something slightly new and is aware of it. "Domingo made tamales," he said. "Too many, as usual. He sent some over." He was holding a covered pot. Mae Bell looked at the pot and then at Phineas Cooper in his clean shirt, because it was a clean shirt, she noticed, not the work shirt, and she felt a smile come up from somewhere deep and genuine. "That's very thoughtful of Domingo," she said. Something in Phineas's posture relaxed in a way that told her he had been more nervous about this than he'd appeared. "He did specifically ask me to tell you they're better hot," he said. Mae Bell put her book down and stood up from the teacher's table. "Then we'd better eat them before they cool," she said. They sat on the new front steps, which had become their habitual location for conversation, eating Domingo's tamales in the long summer dusk, while the sky went from blue to gold to a deep rose-tinged violet. Phineas had also, without making a production of it, brought 2 tin cups and a small pot of coffee, and Mae Bell found herself thinking that this was one of the better evenings she could remember in quite some years. "Can I ask you something?" Phineas said, when they had been sitting quietly for a time. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the grass where a night breeze was beginning to move. "When you bought this place sight unseen, were you frightened?" Mae Bell considered the question honestly. "Not frightened exactly," she said. "More like deliberately not giving myself time to be frightened. I made the decision and then I moved very quickly so there wasn't space for doubt." "That takes a particular kind of courage," he said. "Or a particular kind of stubbornness," she said. "The two are difficult to tell apart." He laughed, a real laugh, fuller than she had heard from him before, and it changed his face entirely, softened the carved limestone jaw, made the brown eyes bright. Mae Bell looked at him laughing in the violet dusk and felt the peculiar weightlessness of a moment that is going to matter. "What about you?" she said. "Coming to Texas at 21 from Tennessee. Was that frightening?" "Terrifying," he said without hesitation. "But also the only thing that made sense. I had a very clear picture of what I wanted, and it wasn't in Tennessee." He paused. "The picture wasn't exactly right. I thought I wanted a bigger operation than what I have, more acres, more cattle. And then I got what I have, and it turned out to be what I actually needed." "There's a lesson in that," Mae Bell said. "There usually is," he agreed. They sat in the dusk, comfortable in each other's company in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have been like interrupting something. August arrived with blazing heat, and the kind of flat blue-white sky that made the Texas landscape look both magnificent and merciless. Mae Bell had 1 month until the school opening, and she drove herself through the final preparations with focused intensity, setting up the classroom with the new desks. installing the wood stove with help from Sam Pryor, who turned out to know how to connect a stovepipe, hanging the large world map she had ordered all the way from a publishing house in New York, organizing her textbooks and slates, and chalk with the care of someone, arranging the elements of a thing they have been planning for years. She also, in this final month, began to reckon honestly with what was happening between her and Phineas Cooper. It was not a mystery, exactly. The tamale evening had been followed by 2 more shared suppers. Once when Clara Hennessy had sent over an extraordinary amount of food, and Mae Bell had sent a message to the ranch, suggesting Phineas come share it. And once when he had appeared with a dressed rabbit from his property's hunting ground, they had cooked it over the outdoor fire behind the schoolhouse, and talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing. They had gone riding twice on the open land to the south of town, Mae Bell on her sturdy brown mare Cora and Phineas on a big roan gelding named Fletcher, and those rides had been the kind of thing she would have been reluctant to call anything particular except that they clearly were. He was careful with her, not careful in the way of a man who thinks a woman is fragile, quite the opposite. He was careful in the way of a man who understands that what is between them is worth being precise about, worth not rushing past or mishandling. He never overstepped and never retreated more than he should. He stood at exactly the right distance and held her gaze the right amount and listened as though what she said was worth listening to, which was, Mae Bell reflected, a more romantic quality than most of the more obviously romantic things men had done in her direction over the years. She was in love with him. She had arrived at this conclusion somewhere in the 3rd week of August, sitting at her teacher's table grading practice arithmetic problems she had sent home with Thomas Hennessy, and had felt the recognition arrive with a calm certainty that was entirely without drama. She was in love with Phineas Cooper. Well, that was a fact she was going to have to deal with. She did not deal with it immediately, partly because the school opening was 2 weeks away, and she could not afford to be distracted, and partly because she had the strong impression that the conversation needed to happen naturally rather than being forced into existence, and partly because she was, despite her considerable practical courage, somewhat terrified of what it would mean to say it aloud. The town of Calico Flats, meanwhile, had opinions. Ruth Crandall delivered these opinions with the gentle efficiency of a woman who has decided that someone needs to be told something. "That man has come over to your property 14 times this month," she said one evening with the precision of someone who had been keeping count, "not including fence work." "He's a good neighbor," Mae Bell said. "He is," Ruth agreed. "He's also a very good-looking man who has never in 11 years shown any particular interest in being a good neighbor to anyone else." She paused. "I'm just making an observation." Clara Hennessy was more direct. "Phineas Cooper is going to fall over himself on your front steps one of these days," she said, helping Mae Bell hang the coat rack. "And then where will you be?" "I'll be handing him the first aid kit from my traveling bag," Mae Bell said. Clara laughed. "Mae Bell," she said, "if you are not careful, you are going to let a perfectly good man get away out of pride." "I'm not letting anyone get away," Mae Bell said. "Then for heaven's sake do something about it," Clara said. Mae Bell did not reply to this, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The week before the school opening, there was a community supper at the church, a gathering that Ruth Crandall had organized primarily as a celebration for the school, but that served double duty as a general social occasion, which Calico Flats embraced with the enthusiasm of a town that did not have many large gatherings. Tables were set up in the churchyard and every family brought food, and by late afternoon there was an extraordinary quantity of roasted meat and corn bread and pies and beans, and a considerable amount of laughter. And the whole event had the quality of something that a small community does when it is feeling good about itself. Mae Bell stood near the schoolhouse, which was visible from the churchyard, and which in the evening light looked beautiful white and solid and purposeful against the wide Texas sky. Several of the families who had enrolled their children came to talk to her, and she spoke with each of them warmly, noting the children's names, asking what they knew already and what they were most interested to learn. Domingo's 3 grandchildren were there: Lucia, who was 10 and possessed of a ferocious intelligence that burned in her eyes, and the 2 boys, Marco and Felipe, 8 and 6 respectively. Domingo himself, a small dignified man with silver in his hair and a mustache that he maintained with great care, shook Mae Bell's hand and said in careful English that she was doing a good thing, and that the children's mother, his daughter Rosa, who was widowed and working in Amarillo, was very grateful. "They will write letters to their mother," Mae Bell told him. "Good letters by the end of the year." Domingo's eyes went bright and he pressed her hand between both of his. Mae Bell felt the weight of that gesture for a long time afterward. Phineas was at the supper too, and she saw him across the crowded churchyard, talking to the ranchers, to the blacksmith, to the postmaster Gerald Holt, who turned out in person to be considerably less suspicious than his letters had suggested. Phineas caught her eye across the yard once and gave her a small nod, and Mae Bell nodded back, and then they were both pulled back into separate conversations. But she was aware of him all evening in the way you are aware of something that has become important to you. At the end of the evening, when the tables were being cleared and the families were loading up their wagons for the drive home, Mae Bell found herself standing at the edge of the churchyard watching the last of the sunset, the sky going from amber to deep violet, the first stars appearing. She heard his footsteps on the grass behind her and turned before he spoke. Phineas stopped a few feet away. He had his hat in his hand. He looked at her in the fading light with an expression that was past careful now, past the controlled assessment she had watched him deploy for months. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has run out of things to say except the true thing. "Mae Bell," he said. She waited. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to be respectful of the fact that you came here to do something specific and important, and I did not want to be a distraction from that." He paused. "But I find that I am not very good at pretending I feel less than I do." Mae Bell looked at him steadily, feeling her heart beating with a clarity that made the whole wide Texas sky seem very close and present. "What do you feel?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, quietly and directly, "Like the best part of every day is the part that happens near you." The last of the evening's light was gold on the grass, on the white schoolhouse, on the wide, honest face of Phineas Cooper. Mae Bell took 3 steps across the grass and stood in front of him, close enough to see the exact color of his eyes in the dusk, and she said, "It took you long enough to say that." Something broke open in his expression, some last reserve of careful restraint, and he laughed again in that full, genuine way, and then he reached out and took her hand in both of his, large, warm hands, careful as always, and held it as though it were something worth holding carefully. "I've been watching you fix that building since April," he said. "You walked around it the first day like you could already see what it was going to be, like it was already finished in your mind and you were just catching reality up." "I've been told I'm impatient with reality," she said. "I've been told I'm too slow," he said. "Perhaps we balance out," she said. He held her hand in the dark churchyard while the stars came out above the flat Texas sky, and the town of Calico Flats drove home in their wagons, and the schoolhouse stood white and ready at the end of the road, and Mae Bell felt the particular profound happiness of a woman who has built the life she wanted, and found that the life she wanted has something in it she did not think to plan for, which is the best kind of surprise. She did not kiss him that evening. She held his hand for a long while, and they talked in the quiet way of people who have crossed into new territory and are finding their footing, and then they walked back toward the schoolhouse together, and at her door he stood for a moment and looked at her with the expression of a man who is very specifically not going to rush anything. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and so earnest that it made her breath catch. And then he said good night and walked back across the dark field to his ranch, and Mae Bell stood on her new front steps and looked at the stars and felt entirely, completely, embarrassingly happy. The school opened on the first Monday of September, 1879, and it was one of the finest days Mae Bell could remember. She was up at 5 in the morning, reviewing her lesson plan for the fourth time, telling herself she was not nervous, being entirely unconvinced by her own assurance. By 7:30 she had dressed in her best blue wool dress, which was practical but also the dress she liked best, and had arranged the classroom so that it looked welcoming and purposeful, desks in 2 rows, the world map visible from every seat, the blackboard clean and ready, the wood stove ready to be lit when autumn came, a jar of late summer wildflowers from the field behind the building set on the corner of the teacher's table because she thought color mattered. The children arrived with their parents between 8 and 8:30. There were 17 of them in the end. She had acquired one more family in the final week, a family named Walsh who had moved to the county from Oklahoma and had 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 13. They came in varying states of eagerness, some openly excited, darting looks at everything, some carefully reserved, waiting to evaluate, some clearly terrified and clinging to their mother's skirts until Mae Bell crouched down to their level and spoke to them quietly and directly and watched the terror ebb. She stood at the front of the classroom at 8:30 precisely and looked at the 17 faces looking back at her, and she felt the fulfillment of something she had been working toward for so long that the arrival of the moment had an almost physical quality, a warmth, a settling, like a bone going back into its proper place. "My name is Miss Bell," she said. "This is your school. It belongs to this community, which means it belongs to each of you. What we do here, we do together." She spent the first hour learning every name. She had them introduce themselves and asked each child one question: what was one thing they knew well, and one thing they wanted to learn? The answers ranged from the practical to the unexpected. Thomas Hennessy knew how to shoe a horse and wanted to learn navigation by stars. Lucia Domingo knew how to cook 3 dozen traditional recipes and wanted to learn to read maps. A small red-headed girl named Anna Walsh knew every wildflower in Oklahoma and wanted to know how to write stories. And Felipe Domingo, age 6 and the smallest person in the room, said gravely that he knew how to feed chickens and that he wanted to learn everything. Mae Bell wrote every answer in her notebook and used them for the rest of the year. Phineas came that afternoon, after school had ended and the last child had gone home. He came over the fence line in his good shirt, which Mae Bell had learned to recognize as a sign that he considered something important. He stood at the door and looked into the classroom, at the blackboard with its still visible first lesson, at the neat rows of desks, at the jar of wildflowers. "How was it?" he asked. Mae Bell was sitting at her teacher's table with the day's notes in front of her. She looked at him across the room. "Perfect," she said. "Not in the sense that nothing went wrong." Anna Walsh cried for 20 minutes and Felipe tipped his desk over, and Thomas got into an argument with the oldest Walsh boy about the best route to Abilene. But perfect in the sense that it was exactly what it should be. Phineas walked into the room and sat in one of the student desks, one of the larger ones near the back, which, given his considerable size, was genuinely funny. Mae Bell smiled at him. "You look very dignified in that desk," she said. "I feel 11 years old," he said. "Did you like school when you were 11? "I liked it when the teacher was interesting," he said. "Mine was not always interesting." "I intend to always be interesting," Mae Bell said. He looked at her across the classroom in the late afternoon light. "I have no doubt about that," he said. She stood up from the teacher's table and went to sit at the desk nearest his, a slightly absurd situation that made them both aware of it and smile. They sat in the children's desks in the quiet of the empty schoolroom and talked about the day, and Mae Bell told him about each child with genuine affection, about what she had seen in them, about who was going to be a challenge, and who was going to surprise everyone, and who was going to need the most patience. He listened the way he always listened, wholly, attending to the specifics rather than the general drift. He asked about Lucia in particular, and when Mae Bell described the intelligence she had seen burning in the girl, something in his expression went still with a kind of pride that was touching, because these were his cook's grandchildren, and she understood suddenly that he felt responsible for them in the way that people in ranch communities felt responsible for everyone in their circle. "She's remarkable," Mae Bell said. "I mean that seriously, Phineas. That girl is going to accomplish something significant." Phineas looked at the floor for a moment. Her mother Domingo's daughter Rosa, she worked very hard to send the children here rather than having them stay in Amarillo, he said quietly. She gave up having them close to her so they could be here. She works in a boarding house, sends their keep. He paused. "I don't know if she fully knows what she gave them access to." "I'll write to her," Mae Bell said. "I'll tell her about Lucia specifically." He looked at her then with an expression that undid her completely, not romantic, not the careful warmth she had come to know, but something deeper and simpler, just the look of a man who sees someone being genuinely good and is moved by it in the way that honest goodness always moves honest people. "Mae Bell," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission. Sunday suppers and rides and whatever you'll allow." He paused. "I know you have a school to run, and I know you didn't come to Texas to find a husband. But I'd rather say it plainly than go on pretending I have fence repairs that happen to put me on this side of the property line." Mae Bell looked at him in the September light that came through the clean schoolhouse windows, and she felt again that deep calm certainty she had felt in August, and she said, "Phineas Cooper, you have my full and enthusiastic permission." He smiled then, not the brief managed smile he sometimes deployed, but the full open smile she had first seen in the churchyard when he laughed, the one that made him look entirely different. And he reached across the narrow gap between their small borrowed desks and took her hand, and they sat like two oversized students in the afternoon light, holding hands in Mae Bell's finished schoolhouse, and it was one of the most quietly perfect moments of either of their lives. The courtship that followed was conducted with the particular blend of earnestness and practicality that defined both their characters. Phineas came for Sunday supper every week, which meant Domingo often sent food, because Phineas apparently considered the practical question of supper somewhat secondary to the fact of the visit, and Domingo considered this characteristically impractical and resolved it himself. Mae Bell baked her own contributions as well, practicing recipes from a cookbook Ruth Crandall had lent her, and her biscuits in particular became something Phineas mentioned with a reverence that she found both flattering and funny. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, ranging out across the flat open grassland in the long autumn light. Mae Bell had grown up in Missouri's rolling country, and the Texas flatness still struck her as extraordinary, the sheer width of the sky, the way the horizon was always so much farther than you expected. Phineas knew this land the way he knew his own hands, and he showed it to her with the quiet pride of a man sharing something he loves. He showed her the spring-fed creek that ran through the southeast corner of his property, lined with cottonwood trees that had gone gold in October, their leaves catching the light and holding it. He showed her where the cattle bunched in cold weather, the natural windbreak formed by a long shallow ridge on the northern boundary. He showed her the way the light hit the land at evening, the specific quality of a Texas sunset that turned the whole west into fire and the east into a deep luminous violet. Mae Bell, for her part, showed him the school. She showed him what was happening in that room, the way it changed week by week as the children gained confidence, the way Lucia was already reading at a level well above her age, the way Felipe had stopped tipping his desk over and had started drawing maps that were genuinely impressive, the way Thomas had discovered in the history books a passion for the stories of exploration that gave his serious face an expression of open wonder she found beautiful. They showed each other the things that mattered to them. This was how they fell in love, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the steady accumulation of showing each other what was true. In November, a difficulty arrived that tested both of them. A man named Weston Briggs came through Calico Flats, a large property rancher from the eastern part of the county who had interests in several concerns, and who had been making noise for years about wanting to consolidate the land in the area. He was not a villain in any theatrical sense, but he was a man of a particular type that the West produced with some frequency. Wealthy enough to believe his preferences were conclusions, accustomed enough to getting his way that other people's no had become a sound he needed to process carefully before it quite registered. Briggs had heard about the schoolhouse. Specifically, he had looked at the land records and noted that the old schoolhouse property sat at an interesting junction between several larger parcels, and he had his own ideas about what could be done with that land if the schoolhouse were to relocate to a less inconvenient location. He appeared in Calico Flats on a Tuesday in November and presented himself at the schoolhouse door during school hours, which Mae Bell considered a significant breach of courtesy. She met him at the door. The 17 children were visible behind her, various stages of their arithmetic lesson frozen in mid-motion, wide eyes watching. Briggs was broad and florid, and wore an expensive coat, and spoke with the expansive confidence of a man who had found that physical presence alone frequently settled conversations in his favor. He made his offer. The land, he said, was worth considerably more than Mae Bell had paid for it, and he was prepared to pay her that considerable more, and she could find a very suitable building somewhere in town for her school, somewhere perhaps more convenient for the families. Mae Bell listened to all of this with a pleasant expression that gave away nothing. "Mr. Briggs," she said when he finished, "I bought this property. I restored this building. This is a school that serves 17 children who have been waiting 7 years for a proper education. My answer is no." Briggs processed this for a moment and then said that she should think it over, that his offer was very generous, and that things in this part of the country had a way of being difficult for those without well-established roots. Mae Bell looked at him steadily. "I have 17 families in this county who send their children to my school," she said. "I have a community that helped build and restore this building. I have been here since April, and I intend to be here considerably longer. I would say my roots are quite established." She paused. "I suggest you look elsewhere for your consolidation plans. Good day, Mr. Briggs." She closed the door with great precision. Behind her, 17 children who had heard every word sat in absolute silence for one moment, and then Thomas Hennessy said, in a tone of deep appreciation, "Miss Bell, that was something." "Arithmetic," Mae Bell said. "Page 47, all of you." Briggs did not leave quietly. He spent 2 days in town having conversations with various people implying, without quite stating, that the schoolhouse land would be more useful to the county as part of a consolidated ranch property, that progress sometimes required difficult decisions, and that a woman alone operating a school on a shoestring budget was perhaps not a sustainable long-term proposition. When Phineas heard about this, which he did from Clara Hennessy's husband Frank, who had heard it at the general store, his reaction was not dramatic. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that, Mae Bell had learned, meant he was deciding on his course of action with care. Then he rode into town and had conversations of his own. Phineas Cooper had 11 years of history in Calico Flats, 1,100 cattle, a 4,000-acre spread, and a reputation for being both fair and not particularly patient with people who substituted money for principle. He was known and respected throughout the county. His conversations were brief and clear. The school was a community institution, the teacher was conducting herself with exceptional dedication, and the land belonged to her and was not available, and Weston Briggs was a guest in this county, not a resident, and perhaps that distinction should inform his expectations. By the time Briggs left on Thursday morning, the matter was effectively closed. He would look elsewhere. Mae Bell, who learned what Phineas had done from Ruth Crandall, as she learned most things that happened in town, went to the fence line that Thursday afternoon and waited for Phineas to come past. When he appeared from the direction of the north pasture, he stopped his horse and came down from the saddle when he saw her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I am entirely capable of handling Mr. Briggs on my own." "I know that too," he said. "You handled him very capably on Tuesday. I just went and made sure he had heard from more than one direction." He paused. He was the kind of man who discounts a woman's no. "I wanted to make sure the no came from a direction he couldn't discount." Mae Bell looked at him. She wanted to be irritated, to explain that she did not need protecting, that she had not come to Texas to have a man stand in front of her. But the thing was, Phineas had not stood in front of her. He had stood beside her, and he had spoken to the kind of injustice that was real, that Briggs had in fact dismissed her no, and that the world was full of men like that, and fighting them required both individual courage and collective support, and Phineas had provided support without undermining her. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. "I'm making a proper meal. Domingo doesn't need to send anything." Something in his face was warm and careful and entirely present. "I'll be there," he said. December brought cold to the Panhandle. Not the brutal deep freeze of further north, but a dry, penetrating chill that made the flat land look both beautiful and austere under the wide, pale sky. The school was warm, the wood stove doing exactly the work Phineas had suggested it would, the cedar smell of burning wood threading through the classroom all winter long. Mae Bell had the children take turns stoking it in the mornings, a responsibility they took with tremendous seriousness. The school continued to thrive. The end-of-year work she assigned showed progress that exceeded her most optimistic projections. Lucia was reading at an adult level, and had written an account of her family's journey from Mexico to Texas that was genuinely moving. Thomas had solved an astronomy problem correctly using methods Mae Bell had only briefly introduced, and even the youngest children, including Felipe, were reading simple sentences with increasing confidence. She wrote long letters to Rosa Domingo and Amarillo describing her children's progress, and Rosa wrote back in a careful formal hand that contained, between the lines, everything a mother feels when someone tells her that her children are seen and valued. Christmas in Calico Flats was celebrated with the particular exuberance of a community that had decided it was having a good year. The church organized a celebration that involved music and food and the reading of scripture, and, inevitably, children performing a Christmas pageant that Mae Bell had helped them prepare, which was ambitious in scope and entirely charming in execution, particularly when Felipe Domingo, cast as one of the Magi, forgot his lines and improvised freely, and with absolute confidence for 2 minutes in a mixture of English and Spanish that the audience responded to with complete delight. After the pageant, after the supper, after most of the families had loaded their children into wagons and headed home, Mae Bell and Phineas stood together in the churchyard under the cold December sky, which was blazing with stars in the way that only a clear country winter sky can blaze. She had her coat pulled close, and he was standing near enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, and the stars were extraordinary. "I love this sky," Mae Bell said. "It's the best thing about this part of the country," Phineas agreed. "Nothing in the way, nothing blocking it." She turned to look at him. His face in the starlight was very clear, and he was looking at the sky with the particular expression she had come to love, thoughtful and present, looking at things as they actually were rather than as he needed them to be. "Phineas," she said. He turned from the sky to her. He looked at her the way the country looked at the sky, open and without obstruction. She went up on her toes and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who has made up her mind, which is to say it was warm and direct and entirely sincere. He made a small sound of surprise, and then his hands came up to her face, careful as always, and he kissed her back with the steadiness and the honesty that were the most essential things about him, and the stars wheeled overhead and the Texas cold wrapped around them, and neither of them was cold at all. When they parted, he kept his hands at her face, looking at her with an expression she could not fully read in the starlight, but that made her heart feel very full. "I should have done that months ago," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I thought about it in August. "The evening with the tamales," she said. "The evening before that," he said. "The evening we set the fence posts." Mae Bell looked at him in the starlight. "Phineas Cooper," she said. "I'm very glad I bought that schoolhouse." He laughed, and then he pulled her close and held her against his chest in the way of a man who has been careful with something valuable for a long time and is now finally holding it properly. She felt his heartbeat against her ear and the vast cold Texas sky above them and the warmth of the church behind them and the sound of the last of the wagons creaking home in the dark. "Mae Bell," he said into her hair, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I fell in love with you in May," he said. "When you were on the ladder pulling off those shingles and you had sawdust in your hair and you were arguing with Gus Hartley about the best kind of roofing nail and you won the argument." Mae Bell pulled back enough to see his face. "I was right about the roofing nails," she said. "You were absolutely right about the roofing nails," he agreed. "And I stood at my fence line and watched you and thought, that is the most remarkable person I have ever seen." She looked at him in the starlight for a moment. Then she said, "I fell in love with you when you brought that wood stove." "The stove," he said. "Because I knew you had been thinking about it," she said. "About that empty rectangle on the floor, about what the room needed. You had been paying attention to my school the way I pay attention to it. That's when I knew." He kissed her again, there in the cold December church yard, and it was even better than the first time because the first time had been a declaration, and this time was a conversation, and the difference between those two things is everything. January was cold and February was colder, and the school and the ranch and the town went about their winter lives with the determined practicality of people who have chosen to live in a particular place and committed to its terms. Mae Bell and Phineas were, by this point, something the town had incorporated with warm approval. They were not dramatic about each other in public. They were not given to displays, but they were clearly and visibly a pair in the way that two people are when they have stopped performing and started simply being. He had dinner at the schoolhouse 3 times a week. She rode out to the ranch on Saturdays and took her lunch in the big kitchen with Domingo, who had adopted her with the decisive completeness of a man who had decided she was already family and was simply waiting for the paperwork. Domingo taught her his tamale recipe in February, the full detailed version, and declared her execution acceptable, which from Domingo was high praise. In March, on a Sunday afternoon when the land was showing the first green of the returning grass, Phineas brought her to the creek, the spring-fed creek lined with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to bud, the slender branches showing the first faint green. It was a warm afternoon for March, and the creek ran clear and fast over its limestone bed, and the cottonwood buds caught the light and held it like small promises. He had brought a blanket and she had brought a basket of food, and they sat on the creek bank in the March sun and ate and talked and were quiet by turns. They had reached the kind of ease that is only possible between people who have stopped needing to present themselves and have started simply being. "I want to ask you something," Phineas said. He was looking at the creek, his elbows on his knees, turning a smooth river stone over in his hands. Mae Bell watched him. She had learned to read his silences the way she read his sentences. "All right," she said. He turned from the creek to look at her. He was doing the thing again, the full honest look, nothing held back, nothing managed. He said, "Mae Bell, I would like to marry you." She felt it move through her, not surprise exactly, but the profound pleasure of hearing something spoken that has long been true. The creek ran over its stones. The cottonwood buds trembled in the mild wind. The Texas sky was bright and enormous above them. "Yes," she said, "I would very much like that." He smiled, the full open smile, the one that changed his whole face, and he reached out and took her hands in his, and they sat by the creek in the March sunshine holding each other's hands with the simplicity of people who have found what they were looking for and know it. "I want to build on," he said. "The ranch house. Add on properly, make it right for a family. The school is part of the arrangement," Mae Bell said. "That's important to me. I'm not a school teacher who also happens to be a wife. I'm both. "I know that," he said. "The school is yours. It belongs to this community and it belongs to you, and nothing about marrying me changes that." He paused. "I would never ask it to." "I know," she said. "I know that about you." She squeezed his hands. "That's part of why the answer is yes." They were married in June, on the first anniversary of Mae Bell's arrival in Calico Flats. They were married at the church by the preacher, whose wife cried through the entire ceremony with an expression of enormous satisfaction. The church was full. Every family who had a child in the school was there, and most of the other families in the county as well. And Gus Hartley was there with sawdust somehow still in his hair despite the occasion. And the Walsh family who had arrived from Oklahoma and whose 3 children had thrived in the school. And Gerald Holt, the postmaster, who had been expecting something peculiar about Mae Bell and had found something entirely different. Domingo made the wedding food, which was extraordinary, and the reception was held in the schoolhouse yard and spread out onto the ranch property, because the two were adjacent, and the crowd was large enough to use both. And there was music from a fiddle player named Jim Crawford who played with real skill, and dancing on the flat Texas grass until the stars came out. Mae Bell stood at one point during the dancing in the middle of the yard, watching all of it, the children chasing each other at the edges of the gathering, the couples turning in the fiddle music, Lucia Domingo dancing with Thomas Hennessy in a pair that had clearly decided they liked each other, Domingo talking with great seriousness to Gus Hartley about something architectural, Ruth Crandall looking at everything with the expression of a woman who organized this party before it was planned. And she felt a fullness that was almost overwhelming, not just happiness, something larger, the feeling of a life that has gone the right direction. Phineas came up behind her and stood with his arm around her waist, looking out at the same view. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad," she said simply. "So am I," he said. He pressed his lips to her temple, light and warm, and she leaned into him and watched the stars come out above her school and her town and her life, and was entirely, wholly, contentedly glad. The years that followed were full ones. The school grew. By the second year, Mae Bell had 23 students, and by the third, 31, and it became necessary to expand the building, which Gus Hartley did with the same careful quality he had brought to the original restoration. Mae Bell hired an assistant teacher in the 4th year, a young woman from San Antonio named Elena Vargas, who had been educated at a mission school, and who turned out to be a gifted teacher of the youngest children. The community supported the school with the committed enthusiasm of people who have seen firsthand what education does to a town, and the school board that formed in Calico Flats in 1882 was an entirely different institution from the one in Missouri that had dismissed Mae Bell. This one was led by Clara Hennessy's husband Frank, and included Dolores Vega and Ramon, and a rancher named Webb who had 2 sons in the school. And they treated Mae Bell with the respect of people who understand that they are supporting something important. Rosa Domingo came to visit from Amarillo in the fall of 1881 and spent 2 weeks in Calico Flats, and Mae Bell spent an entire afternoon sitting with her in the schoolroom showing her Lucia's work. The essays, the arithmetic, the geography projects, the letter Lucia had written to the governor of Texas on the subject of public education, which was not sent but which was extremely persuasive. Rosa sat at one of the student desks reading her daughter's work with tears tracking silently down her face, and Mae Bell sat at the teacher's table and let the silence say what it needed to say. Lucia Domingo, it should be noted, went on to study at a school in San Antonio when she was 16, and eventually became a teacher herself, the first teacher of Mexican descent in her county, which was a fact that Mae Bell considered among the finest accomplishments of her school. Phineas proved to be exactly what she had understood him to be, a man whose character in courtship was the same as his character in marriage: steady, honest, attentive, and capable of great warmth when he stopped being careful. They argued occasionally, as 2 strong-willed people inevitably do, and their arguments were direct and not without heat, but they were also always resolved because both of them considered the resolution more important than the satisfaction of winning. He added on to the ranch house as he had promised, a parlor, a proper bedroom, a study for Mae Bell where she could prepare lessons and write her letters and read in the evenings, and which she filled with books ordered from publishing houses in New York and St. Louis, and which became, over time, the best library in Calico Flats. He built a covered walkway between the ranch house and the schoolhouse because Mae Bell had to go back and forth in all weather, and he did this without discussion, simply appeared one September morning with Gus and the lumber and built it. "You didn't ask me," Mae Bell said when she saw it. "Do you dislike it?" Phineas said. She looked at the walkway. It was well made, covered with a solid roof, with a railing at the right height. It went from the side door of the ranch house to the back door of the schoolhouse in a straight, practical line. "No," she said, "I love it." "Then I made the correct judgment," he said. Mae Bell shook her head at him, but she was smiling. Their first child was born in the spring of 1881. A boy they named James Henry Cooper. Henry for Phineas's father in Tennessee and James, because Mae Bell had always liked the name. He arrived on a wet April night with Ruth Crandall attending and Phineas in the next room wearing a path in the floor that Mae Bell could hear quite clearly. And when Ruth placed James in his father's arms, Phineas stood very still for a long moment looking at his son with an expression that Mae Bell, watching from the bed, found impossible to describe except as a man discovering a new country and knowing that he has always belonged there. James was a large, healthy baby who quickly became a large, determined toddler who had his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and who by age 3 had an opinion about most things and was willing to share it at length. He followed Phineas around the ranch with the concentrated devotion of a small person who has decided that his father is the most interesting thing on the property, which Phineas bore with a combination of delight and genuine parenting effort. Their second child, a daughter named Clara Rose Cooper, Clara for Clara Hennessy, who had become Mae Bell's closest friend, and Rose because the wild roses bloomed in the schoolhouse yard every June, came in the summer of 1883, and was from her first moments a person of strong opinions and considerable charm, which the entire town agreed she had inherited from both parents in equal measure. When Clara Rose was born, James Cooper, age 2, regarded his new sister with the serious assessment of a person encountering new data, and then announced, "Small," which was his entire evaluation and which, given that Clara Rose grew up to be notably capable of making herself heard in any situation, turned out to be only temporarily accurate. Biscuit the border collie, who had observed all of this family expansion, with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who has been foreman long enough to manage change, eventually retired from her supervisory position at an extremely advanced canine age, beloved by everyone, and was succeeded by a new border collie puppy named Pepper, who James named, and who quickly decided that James and Clara Rose were her personal responsibility. The school that Mae Bell, she still used her teaching name, Bell, in the schoolroom, a detail that amused Phineas and that she maintained because it was her name, given by her parents, earned by her 8 years of work, and not surrendered for any reason including a perfectly good marriage. The school that Mae Bell ran became the anchor of Calico Flats in exactly the way that Phineas had described when he talked about how the town had been before it went 7 years without one. Families stayed in the county rather than leaving. Young people who might have gone east for education had a reason to stay. The town grew, not dramatically but steadily and soundly, in the way that towns grow when they have real institutions at their center. In the evenings, when the school was quiet and the children were asleep, and the ranch hands had settled into the bunkhouse, Mae Bell and Phineas sat on the front steps of the schoolhouse. Those original cedar steps that they had sat on so many times, beginning that first April when he had come to tell her about the collapsed rafters, and she had written his name in her notebook. and they looked out at the flat Texas land and the enormous sky, and talked the way people talk when they know each other completely, and find that there is always, still, more to say. He told her once on a summer evening in 1884, watching the last of the light go out of the western sky, "I used to think this land was just mine. Mine to work, mine to run, mine to tend." He paused. "Now I think of it differently. It's ours. The ranch, the school, the town, we made it what it is." "The town made itself," Mae Bell said. "We just added our part." "That's what I mean," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm Texas evening with the stars beginning to appear, one by one, above the flat, wide horizon. Behind them in the ranch house, James and Clara Rose were asleep, and through the schoolhouse windows the world map caught the last light and held it. The wood stove that Phineas had brought over from his storage barn stood in the center of the room, cold in the summer warmth, waiting patiently for October. Mae Bell thought about the morning she had driven into Calico Flats, the way the town had stopped breathing for a moment, the way she had felt the deed in her hand and the determination in her chest, the way she had pulled up in front of the ruined schoolhouse and stood with her hands on her hips, seeing what it could be rather than what it was. She thought about the man at the fence line with his fence pliers and his careful eyes, who had watched her with the attention of someone recognizing something, who had come back over and over with practical excuses that were never quite the whole truth. She thought about how the building had looked the first day she saw it, broken and abandoned and full of possibility, and how it looked now, white and solid in the summer dusk, windows full of light, the covered walkway connecting it to their home, the schoolyard where the children played, and the cedar fence posts that Phineas had helped her set still holding exactly where they had been placed. She thought about how strange it was that a single advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper had led to all of this, had led to James sleeping in the next room, and Clara Rose's small, determined face, and Lucia Domingo's letter to the governor and Thomas Hennessy, understanding navigation by stars, and Felipe standing at the front of the classroom at age 8, and explaining the water cycle to his classmates with the confidence of a person who had found his voice and had no intention of giving it back. "What are you thinking about?" Phineas said. "Roofing nails," Mae Bell said. He laughed. She could feel it against her shoulder, warm and real, the same laugh she had first heard in the churchyard 3 years ago. She smiled at the darkening sky, at the stars coming out above her school and her ranch and her life. "You're still right about the roofing nails," he said. "I know," she said. They sat on the cedar steps, watching the full Texas night come on, as complete and unobstructed as it had always been, as wide as the life they were still building together without limit under all those honest stars.